Thank you, Emer, and thanks for the opportunity to come here today and talk to you about this piece of work. As Emer said, it's a significant piece of work nationally. It was only published last week, so it is hot off the press, and we're still, I suppose, digesting and circulating the outputs of this. It's particularly relevant to a water audience because in the course of this process, it was a hugely collaborative process. This was a year and a half in the making. Over 80 state agencies, public bodies, private sector organisations fed into this. And as someone said to me in the course of the process, the way a lot of Irish people, or most Irish people, are likely to experience climate change is going to be through water, either at various times not enough of it or too much of it. So it's very, very relevant to what we're talking about today, and it provides that wider context. I think most of you know that the water environment doesn't need any more pressures, but this is another compounding pressure that is increasingly going to be felt as we move forward. So what is the National Climate Change Risk Assessment? First of all, it's a single national assessment. It's an action under the Climate Action Plan that came out of the last round of sectoral adaptation plans, because the risk assessments done in the 12 plans last time round were done using different data, different time horizons, different climate projections, and with different levels of granularity. So it was felt in line with emerging best practice that we needed a single national risk assessment using standardised, really good quality data to translate climate projections, for example, standardised exposure data such as tall to air and prime 2, and standardised approaches to vulnerability, etc. This will, and has, identified, ranked and prioritised national climate change risks for action to, I suppose, focus attention on what needs to be addressed within the next 5 years. And that was a key parameter within the risk assessment, that it identified action required within the next 5 years. It provides a consistent evidence base on which to inform the National Adaptation Framework, the Climate Action Plan, and the Central Bank and local authorities' resilience responses also. And it provides a national reference point that can be periodically updated then. So in terms of the NCCRA, the framework that we used two emissions scenarios. We used RCP 4.5, which is a mid-range scenario. There was a consensus in the technical working groups that this is the, best recognises the path we're on currently. It is not a net zero by 2050 trajectory. We have to be resilient to the net total of global emissions, and RCP 4.5 heading towards RCP 6 is kind of where the globe is tracking at the moment. And we included a worst case scenario, RCP 8.5, a high emissions scenario in it. We looked at 3 time periods, 2030, up to 2030, a medium term 2050, and long term 2100. 2050 can seem very abstract. I think for a lot of people in this room, you're more able to conceptualize it than most, because we are now exactly 25 years from the year 2000 when the Water Framework Directive was brought into force, and it is exactly the same distance forward to 2050. So when you see the conclusions for 2050, you can think back to the year 2000. That's the type of time frame we're talking about. This is a national level assessment. We map the results spatially at a NUTS 3 level, the 8 NUTS 3 regions, so it doesn't go down to a catchment or a project level. That's, I suppose, within the remit of the sectoral adaptation plans. And there was 3 stages in the process. The first was the identification of risks, a kind of a literature review, a collation of evidence from the Irish Climate Change Assessment, the existing sectoral adaptation plans, sectoral experts, a number of which are in the room. We then, in stage 2, we had a long list of risks. We consolidated those down to 115 risks, and we looked at them spatially where we had data. And we got an estimate then spatially of gross risk, where, when and how these risks were likely to manifest themselves across the country under those 2 scenarios and 3 time horizons. In stage 3 then, we looked at adaptation and resilience actions that have either been taken already or that are planned. And what that gave us was a net risk. And then we could establish or try and conceptualize the gap between where we are or where we will be and what constitutes resilience. So where further action is needed to become resilient based on the impacts that we foresee. So just at a really high level and in simple language, what are we seeing or what are we likely to see based on these projections as the century progresses? With a high degree of confidence, we can say that the climate is projected to get warmer. We are seeing that month after month. We are establishing, new monthly records for temperature. We have seen heat waves that are breaking records. That is going to continue. There's going to be, in the chronic sense, an increase in the average temperatures. There's also going to be, we believe, and we're experiencing it, an increase in the magnitude of heat waves. We'll see 34, 35 degrees, etc., as time goes on. Ireland is also projected to become wetter. Again, that has already been observed. That is happening. We have the famous extra month's rainfall since 1980 that we talk about. Where we start to see more uncertainty is in how seasonally that is going to play out. So are we going to get much warmer, wetter winters? Are we going to get drier summers? Are they going to be punctuated by extreme events? There is a degree of uncertainty around how seasonality will play out, but overall, the projections do indicate that we are likely to see more frequent and more intense droughts. Sea level rise, again, is something that we can be a lot more confident about because we've seen it already. In Cork, over the past century, we've seen close to 40 centimetres of sea level rise on average. In Dublin, it's been 20 centimetres. That is projected to continue. So again, we said how close 2050 is. By 2050, under the conservative mid-range scenario, we expect to see on average around the coast a quarter of a metre of sea level rise. That's a lot in a very short space of time. By the end of the century, we think on average around the island it'll be somewhere north of half a metre. And again, that's quite conservative. There's every possibility that is likely to be higher. It's going to be higher in the south. It might be a little bit less in the northern part of the country. But we can say with a high degree of certainty that is the least worst scenario we are facing. Wind is another area where there is more uncertainty. So the models, there's a lot of uncertainty around what average wind speeds and extreme wind speeds are likely to do in future. But what we can say and what we have built into the NCCRA, because we delayed publication on purpose, is that we have just experienced essentially hurricane force winds in Ireland. So we know we get them, we know we have to be resilient to them, and this is where the meeting place of observed data and projected data has to be considered in a risk assessment in adaptation planning. And finally, we know, and again we can say this with a high degree of confidence, that our oceans are they're becoming and projected to become more acidic as time goes on. So that's the overarching concept in terms of the hazard that we face. I just want to very briefly allude to the semi-quantitative nature of this, just to show the science that underpins these results. And this shows the coastal inundation spatial risk assessment that was done. So you can see on the left the NUTS 3 regions. For the first time, and it's a temporary measure until we have a national sea level projection data set, we linked the OPW coastal inundation maps with the Translate climate projections and the IPCC projected sea level rises around the coast. And we then mapped the percentage of each NUTS 3 region that would be flooded under the RCP 4.5, the Translate scenario, at each of the time steps. For exposure, we used the Táilteann Éireann Prime 2, we used census data, the updated population projections, the new ones, prorated by region, national land cover map, etc., where required. And for vulnerability, we used CSO data as well, where we could. And just on the right-hand side, you can see how this plays out on a NUTS 3 scale. I suppose the three coloured bars represent the time scales, or the time horizons. You've got the mid-range emission scenario on the top and the high-end scenario on the bottom. And you can see the proportion of infrastructure, transport infrastructure buildings inundated under each of those scenarios. And that allows us to look at the extent of risk and the level of impact across those scenarios. So we used quantitative data where we had it. And it's the first time this has been done across all sectors of society's systems, I should say as well. We use the European Climate Risk Assessment systems-based approach, so it nests into that. And we've published guidance based on the NCCRA for sectoral adaptation plan risk assessments. So we now have a kind of a common nested system from European down to sectoral scale. And I think we work with the local authorities in the next round of local authority climate action plans for their risk assessments as well. So they should all nest and be coherent with each other. I'm not going to go into detail on this. You probably can't read it, but this is just about our consequence and urgency criteria. These were, again, we tried to be quantitative where we could in terms of economic damage, proportions of GNI star, that's what the impact of the multinational stripped out, impact on people in terms of deaths or serious injury, and other impact categories such as land lost, species, heritage assets, etc. This is downscaled directly from the EU CRA, so again, that nests. On the right-hand side, this is our urgency for action, and the key thing here is that this is action within the next 5 years. So more action needed was the classification, whereas there is a demonstrated existing resilience gap that has to be closed urgently. Further investigation is where there is evidence that we require further investigations to be closed out within the next 5 years. It's not open-ended. So what did we find then? This was the interesting part of it. 115 risks overall across 9 sectors. You can see the sectors, or the systems, I should say, across the bottom: biodiversity and ecosystems, built environment, economy and finance, energy, food production and supply chain, health, marine and coastal ecosystems, social and water security. Those risks are not all equal. Some of those risks cascade into and produce other risks. So the knock-on impact of some make them far more critical than others. 43 of those risks were classified in the risk assessment as becoming critical under either scenario by the end of the century. And critical is a significant level of impact. We did also identify 5 opportunities. I have to caveat that by saying that those opportunities are, they're 4% of the total impacts that we identified. They are all dependent on other risks not materializing, and each of those opportunities come with environmental risks themselves. So they're there, but there's with an asterisk beside them. When we look at how these risks manifest through time, and again, we've done this quantitatively where we could. You've got high emission scenario on the top. I want to focus on the bottom 3 bar charts here. This is essentially RCP 4.5, the emissions trajectory globally that we're currently on. And if you look here at the bottom left graph shows you the current classification of risk. Mid-century is the center one and late century is the right. And what you can see here in the bottom left graph is that presently the majority of risks are in the limited space. Some are deemed to be substantial and only 2 critical. As we move to 2050, which again is a relatively short period of time away, they have all now shifted to the right. The majority now classified as substantial, with about half classified as critical. And as we move towards the end of the century, you're seeing that constant but gradual shift towards now the majority being critical, with some entering the catastrophic classification, which is something that we will have to manage. The cascading risk piece is really key here, and we've seen this recently, and it was very directly related to water infrastructure, water services infrastructure in Storm Éowyn, where trees got knocked down, which took out power, which took out electricity to drinking water plants, which impacted water supply, which then impacted local authorities, the health service, ultimately people in their own homes, and eventually the exchequer. Those cascading impact chains have been mapped in the NCCRA. There's a very detailed spreadsheet behind this where the risks that cascade here on the left into the sectors on the right, the risks are mapped, they're numbered, and that's been shared with all of the adaptation sectors in Ireland for management and appropriate action in the sectoral adaptation plans. So you can see, for example, the huge amount of risks that cascade out of the built environment, that cascade out of energy loss on the left-hand side, and you can see on the right-hand side the significant receptors of risk, not surprisingly, economic and financial impacts, social impacts, health impacts, and biodiversity also up there as well, a much larger recipient of impact than other sectors. So managing those cascading risks, we also saw that, I should mention transboundary risk. We saw that in Storm Dara, where rough seas took out the pier infrastructure in Holyhead, knock-on impacts onto the customs service, retail, and indeed people for Christmas awaiting goods. So these cascading risk chains, both here and internationally, are something that we're very keen to move beyond kind of the slight risk of siloization with the sectoral approach that we have here. So what are the priority risks that we identified? We identified 4 risks for action within the next 5 years, urgent action. Unsurprisingly, the first 2 relate to extreme wind, because there has been very recently a proven resilience gap there that had significant knock-on impacts for essentially millions of people. The first is relating to the vulnerability of the overground electricity transmission and distribution network, and that has to be made resilient, not, as was said in the media last week, that we want to bury all the cables, but they have to be made resilient. We can't bury everything. In terms then of communication, there was also significant damage to overground communications infrastructure in the past storms, especially Éowyn, and there's within the sector, even a recognised resilience gap there in terms of, even the TETRA system for emergency management went down. So they're the top 2 risks. The next 2 relate to the coastal piece. Firstly, and again for urgent action, risk of disruption, damage and loss of transport infrastructure due to sea level rising, coastal inundation and loss of buildings. We see on the East Coast, the East Coast rail network, or the rail line, is particularly vulnerable to coastal erosion. We've seen during the flooding in Middleton and in Storm Éowyn, in both of those cases, there were significant storm surges predicted. They didn't materialise because the tide was out. That was sheer luck. As these events continue to occur, the tide will not be out every time. And there was 4 to 6 metre high storm surges forecast for Éowyn. We've seen in previous events in the past 2 years, boats being dropped onto the top of the quay wall in the Claddagh. There will be events of higher magnitude. And to use a very practical example that Emer mentioned this morning, the wastewater treatment plant is down by the coast. Our wastewater infrastructure, very relevant for this audience, is very, very vulnerable to these risks and called out in them. The inland flooding piece, again, we're all aware of that. We're seeing inland flooding and return periods being exceeded probably faster than we would have expected to. So the risk assessment has identified that an assessment is reassessment of that is called for to see, are we taking adequate steps there to protect that with the rapidity of which those risks are manifesting themselves. And heat then requiring urgent, further investigation. This is linked to the impacts of heat on a rapidly growing and aging population. So this is where we have a high degree of confidence that we're going to see both an increase in average temperatures and an increase in extreme heat waves. We also have a very high degree of confidence that we're going to have a huge increase in number of over 65s who are vulnerable to these events by the mid-century. So there's a huge amount of work required to just, assess what we need to do in that space, because there's a huge vulnerability there. We have a huge exposure to it, and we haven't probably characterized that on a very granular local level to the extent that we need to, given the level of confidence we have in that risk. When we look at water in particular, we know that flooding in terms of water infrastructure, water security, contamination as a result of overland flow into reservoirs, into rivers, as a result of these more extreme, violent flood events that we're seeing is a risk projected to get worse by the end of the century. And again, increases in water demand with a rising population and potentially drought conditions. And in terms of how you address this, we're taking into account a dynamic adaptation pathway. I think we have recent population projections that show our population is rising even faster than was projected to 9 years ago in 2016. So we've had to look now at maybe, do we have enough water for 6.87 million people by 2050? And if the more pessimistic scenarios were to come to pass in terms of reductions in low flow, if we have low flow reductions in our rivers by 2050 of 25% on average across the country, at what point do we have to start taking steps to build more water storage? I think that's something that is called out there in that further investigation piece. The built environment, again, this because of the EU systems, water services, infrastructure, etc., can sit in the built environment system, and we can look at the cascades out of that. So again, risk of damage and loss of life due to sea level rise, coastal erosion. A lot of our wastewater infrastructure is obviously located at the coast, and that requires urgent action now, essentially. Risk of disruption and damage to water services due to flooding, and risk of operational issues due to heat impacts if you're running wastewater treatment plants, etc., or if you've got algal blooms in freshwater sources. When we do see those heat waves into the mid and higher 30s, how are we prepared for that? I don't think we've done enough there based on the expert feedback into the NCCRA. For biodiversity and ecosystems, for the receiving environment, again, there's the contamination piece from this increased rainfall that we're going to see, requiring further investigation. Decreased freshwater quality due to reduced flows. Again, where will that manifest and how, and when is that pressure likely to come on? We see in the biodiversity space in the NCCRA, climate isn't the most immediate pressure on nature, but it is likely to become so by the end of the century, and there will be a tipping point in there when it becomes the greatest pressure by magnitude on the natural environment. Also risk to alteration of freshwater flora and fauna due to changes in temperature, which we're already seeing. I think increased incidences of, and then invasive species that are given freer rein to spread here due to the increase in annual temperatures, the reduction in frost days, etc. Where is that likely to play out? Again, the feedback from the experts involved in the NCCRA, feeding in from the MPWS and others, is that we do need to do more work in that space. So in conclusion, I'd say that in terms of the observed impacts, increase in average temperature, increase in extreme rainfall events, sea level rise, we have already seen and are seeing the impacts of climate change. They're tracking reasonably well with the models that we have to predict them. If anything, they're happening slightly faster than some of the models projected. These impacts, in many instances, we can say with a high degree of confidence, are going to increase in intensity and frequency. Climate is obviously not an isolated risk. The water environment, there are a lot of pressures in the water environment. Climate isn't really one of them currently. It's becoming one. It's going to become increasingly so, and it's going to compound and interact with those existing pressures and challenges, and that's also in the context of a rapidly increasing and aging population. Understanding and managing those cascading impact chains is critically important to bridge the gaps between the silos and see where the risk ownership responsibility lies between sectors to ensure that they're adequately managed. The NCCRA provides a consistent evidence base to inform that adaptation planning process. So 2 sectors, we say energy, water biodiversity, or water services biodiversity, now have a consistent evidence base where they can look at the same risks on the same time horizons and discuss management options without having to look back at the climate models every time they start that conversation. I think it sets out a very clear need for sectoral adaptation plans, to address the urgent action piece and the further investigation piece within the next 5 years as clear actions, clear defined actions within those plans. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.